Have you ever stayed late at work even though you had plans? Or canceled your plans so that you could take care of whatever the latest work emergency is? So, what's underlying those behaviors? Was it because you were afraid that your boss wouldn't appreciate you, thought that you wouldn't be committed enough, that it would impact your performance? How much is fear driving those types of decisions? You're not alone when fear prompts you to actions that you normally wouldn't want to take. Fear is a powerful force when it comes to work-life balance. So let's explore that further today. Today, I'm debunking the myths that keep you chained to your desk and revealing how fear is sabotaging your work-life balance. Fear is a strong motivator, even when it's working subconsciously. The roots of these patterns may be far in the past, even from childhood. And part of what keeps all of these old habits and saying yes to things that you don't really want to do, it keeps it alive, even when you're trying to change them. So let's start with prayer. Lord, thank you for bringing my dear friends to listen today. You know each of us inside and out, our hopes and our fears. You have given us power, love, and a sound mind. Help us recognize when we are taking actions motivated by fear instead of love, and guide us to what is right for this situation. I pray all is well with every listener, healthy in body, renewed in mind, and strong in spirit. As they reduce stress and improve work-life balance, may they know your will and your love. In Jesus' name, amen. In case if we haven't met before, I'm Sharon McCall with Whispering Fields Wellness. I'm a stress recovery coach, and I help people like you that are exhausted and drained from working so many hours in a stressful job find ways to reduce stress and improve work-life balance while still thriving in their career. And I do this because I'm someone that's really struggled with chronic stress and workaholism through my career. I'm in recovery now, and I want to make sure that you have a smoother journey than I did. So as I look back, fear played a significant part in keeping me into those cycles of stress and overwork. So for a long time, my worst case scenario that I was so fearful of was to avoid getting fired. In my mind, I would catastrophize these worst case scenarios about me from being fired. I'd lose the house. I'd lose everything, my relationships, because they wouldn't be able to withstand the challenge of that. And it would just cascade in my brain and set off this whole chain of future events that would result in me being alone and relying on a soup kitchen for my food in my 70s and 80s. I was petrified of this, and this was a strong image and a repeating nightmare that kept spurring me on. I was first aware of its impact when I was in college, working at the mall and providing financial support to the musician that I was dating at the time. And it would just keep recurring during periods of high stress and uncertainty. I would catastrophize and like get stuck in this nightmare whenever stress and exhaustion was really high, and worries like this kept me awake at night. So from all of this fear though, I would get this boost of adrenaline, and it would allow me to power through whatever it was that I was going through. So if I got too low in energy and began to freak out, or got stuck and I couldn't find a solution, this adrenaline boost like powered me through it. It's not a healthy way to do it, but that was how I would use fear to push me through and energize whenever I got stuck. And getting back to that image and that fear, that core fear, it still randomly pops up even these days. I just don't let it fuel stress or negative coping behaviors like the adrenalization that I just mentioned, like I used to. So these worst case fears, they're they can be things that we got brought up with. And they really do influence how we manage our career, our finances, and this really gets to the heart of what's driving our imbalance when we're dealing with stress and overwork. So today we're going to go over common fears and how they impact work-life balance. And then we're going to do an exercise that similar to the capture challenge change that we did for negative thoughts a few episodes ago. Um, just specifically on how do you use your emotions as flags to identify what the right action is that you need to do. So before I get started today, I've shared my worst case scenario. What's your worst case scenario? What's that deep-seated fear that you actively work to avoid? Well, maybe you don't want to put it in the comments, but just sit with it for a moment and think about it. So, for me, the two big themes that were in there is being alone and not having enough money. And so, as I've talked with people over the years, I've realized that there's a number of just common patterns to this. Besides my own, it's the that fear of job loss and financial insecurity, the fear of rejection, not being respected, fear of mistakes, being seen as incapable, that fear of missing out. So, phrased another way, all of these variations of these worst case scenario deep seated fears is a fear of being helpless, unlovable, or unworthy. Many long held fears are rooted in false narratives about worth, security, and acceptance. So, whatever your big fear is, there are all sorts of ways that you are acting out to prevent this worst case scenario, this big scary thing, from happening. And you may or may not know the root of the fear. You may have been protecting yourself from this big scary thing since you were a little kid, and just your habits and your way of coping with it and your responses are just kind of automatic and conditioned since you've been dealing with them since you were a little kid. So, continuing in the example I did, it took me a ton of inner work, prayer, and honestly, only very recently, I realized that this fear of poverty and it's an intergenerational thing that you can't rely on anyone. The world is out to get you. Do everything you can to scrimp and save. That there's never enough. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. These are all kind of thoughts that hid this underlying deep-seated fear about poverty. There's so many generations that came before me that were in subsistence living and um, insecurity related to surviving through the war, depression, and it's only really in my parents' generation that prosperity found, and yet that because of how they'd been brought up, they passed on all of these thoughts that I mentioned and emotions and the fears, and that's all instilled in me. And I've been reacting to this since I was a little kid, and had as I was learning to navigate the world and what were the things that I learned from my parents of what to be aware of and how to protect myself. So for you, you don't need to know what the root of that fear is to be able to begin to address and change how you respond. You don't need to. You just need to use the fear as a flag because it's about one, you as you detect this emotion or related ones, it helps you identify those protective behaviors so that you can focus on those protective behaviors. So you may be wondering what this has to do with work-life balance and stress, but bear with me. I'll get there. I just want to connect a few more dots on this, and you'll be able to see this picture. Let's get in deeper into the ways that these fears influence your behavior at work. And these are just a few examples of protective behavior. So you may recognize the behavior, even if you're not necessarily aware of the emotion that's driving it. So we'll run through a number of these. So we talked about the fear of job loss or financial security. So some ways that this can manifest is overworking to prove your worth. In uncertain economic times or competitive work environments, people may fear that setting boundaries can be perceived as a lack of commitment or dedication, which potentially puts their jobs at risk. So that this belief, this underlying belief that limits you, it can lead to overworking and constantly being available and taking on excessive workloads to demonstrate your value. Maybe the way that this manifests for you is a difficulty in saying no. Fear of being seen as uncooperative or easily replace can make it hard to decline additional tasks or requests, even if it compromises your personal time. So this can lead to burnout or resentment. Maybe it's tolerating unreasonable demands and expectations just out of fear of repercussions, even if those demands consistently violate your personal time. Maybe you set unreasonable expectations for yourself. Maybe it's not that the unreasonable demands are from outside, from your boss or other people at work, but maybe you set unreasonable expectations for yourself. So this is like perfectionism, um, or being so scared of failure and making mistakes that you're getting over involved or lost in the details, which add tasks and time to what you really need to do. So you're, in essence, taking on things that you're not are not necessary as a result of these unreasonable expectations. Another way that this pops up is through controlling or micromanaging, because if you can't make mistakes, it means your team is not allowed to make mistakes. And so you may be micromanaging them, which is again, you're trying to in your efforts to prevent whatever is this worst case scenario at work. You're micromanaging the people and trying to control all of the outcomes so that you can be perceived as valuable and become irreplaceable. Do you recognize any of those behaviors? But do you see how they all tie back to that? Those protective behaviors tie back to that fear of job loss and financial insecurity. These are some different ways than how these protective behaviors lead to work-life imbalance, and it can make it hard to restore balance in your life. So we'll touch on quickly on a couple of these other ones. What about the fear of not being respected or perceived negatively? So we talked a little bit about people pleasing. Another way this pops up is maybe a fear of conflict where you don't want to rock the boat. So it's not even about saying no, it's about not sharing things that people could disagree with. So you get into a communal group think thing if you don't want to take the risk. So even if your idea is the greatest, you might not speak up about it because you don't want to rock the boat. Um, that fear of mistakes or being found out that you're a fraud. So that drives imposter syndrome, and you might push yourself or your team harder than you need to, and working longer hours, taking on extra work, setting up higher levels of expectations, controlling more. There's a lot of different ways that this can manifest in your behavior. But this is all gets back to that fear of not being respected or being perceived negatively. Another one that's got a little bit of some different behaviors behind it is that fear of missing out on opportunities. So some people believe that because the organization is global or a 24/7 organization, um, this you have to be always on. And some companies, they really encourage that because, hey, they'll take advantage of it. If you will work $80 for 80 hours for 40 hours of pay, they want that. And they'll cultivate this whole fear that disconnecting, even just to go to a doctor's appointment, it's going to cause you to miss out on an important information. If you're not constantly checking your emails through the evening, that you're going to miss some important update that's coming from a global partner that you need to respond to by first thing in the morning. And believing that that is the way that you prove yourself is essential, it can drain you, but it keeps you on that point, that whole fear of missing out. And you're constantly, it makes it really hard to disconnect, which is how it impacts work-life balance. Um, Another way that this shows up is also pressure to keep up with your colleagues. So if you see that others are blurring the lines between work and personal life, you may feel pressure to do the same so that you don't miss out on the opportunities that they're being given. So, do any of these behaviors sound familiar to you? Are you starting to kind of see how you may have this core underlying deep-seated fear, and then to prevent that from happening, you have all of these protective behaviors that you do because it helps to ensure that that big scary thing doesn't happen. And when, with a lot of these protective behaviors, you're taking on more. You're taking on more hours, expending more energy. You're It's making it harder for you to maintain work-life balance. In essence, you're working harder than you need to, than your role requires because of all of these protective behaviors. And so that's how fear drives imbalance in your work life. It makes it really difficult sometimes then when you're trying to make these changes. So when you look at your fears, what behaviors do you do to prevent that worst case scenario? What are those protective behaviors? So just a couple of common ones that I've seen pop up: people pleasing, perfectionism, micromanaging, strong pessimism, catastrophizing, imposter syndrome, overachiever. This is just a handful of them. You may have some other parts of you that come up to be those protectors or managers or firefighters that come up whenever these fears are triggered. So now from this like self-evaluation and these examples, do you see how some of these behaviors can contribute to work-life imbalance? It's that extra time and energy beyond what is needed to deliver on the assignment. And as we've talked about before, when you're already in a low point, so when you're stressed and exhausted, you may more lean on these protective behaviors just because they're so automatic, they're so conditioned, they're things that you've been doing for such a long time. So keep in mind, so you may naturally have stopped being a micromanager because you didn't like working for them and you didn't like um, how it felt to be under a micromanager. So you may have consciously decided in your leadership style that you're not a micromanager. But when you get stressed out and you're exhausted and you're at your wit's end, that innate behavior may come back out. So keep in mind some of these things that you know you don't do normally, they may come out when you are absolutely stressed out. And this is why it can be really hard to make changes to improve work-life balance. Because when you're trying to reduce your work hours or change your how you respond to things, you don't it hits one of those fears. So if you're trying to change your working hours and you've got a tendency for people pleasing towards your boss and a need to prove yourself, it may be really difficult for you to have that conversation with him or to not give in on some of those requests. So the way that you can start working through this is to acknowledge the emotion and that protective behavior. And these are cues for you to pause. And sometimes just with what comes up to your awareness, because as you think about some of these scenarios that you are in yourself, I'm going to bet you're probably not really that much aware of fear. Fear is really deep seated. A lot of us are trained not to acknowledge it. So it may be coded in these other emotions that are more acceptable in a way for you to feel. So it may be a different emotion that's signaling to get your attention. So one thing I see that pops up quite a bit is irritation or resentment. Some of that covers up the fear because when you're trying to control and prevent things from happening, that's when anger and its different forms pop up. So let's let's take a look at what can happen in this pause. So let's use an example. When you've decided on your boundaries that leaving at work at 6 p.m. and not taking calls afterwards. So where are those resistance points that you're having to be successful in those new behaviors? That helps you find what those emotions are, what those protective behaviors, what are the ways that this fear is coming up to surface. So what you see whenever you get to that point of resistance, that's like that tip of the iceberg, but that fear is that big old thing that's underwater that's going to sink you if you don't acknowledge and address how you need to safely get around that iceberg. So when you're at these points of resistance, this is that cue for you to pause. And so, if you can, in that pause, go back to your identity in Christ, that truth dissolves the thoughts that are associated with your deep seated fears. So, if we talked about, those core three fears, they have to do with being helpless, unlovable, unworthy. And when you're in conversation with Christ, He can burst all of that and dissolve it away because He always loves you. No matter what has happened in your life, you are worthy of His sacrifice. And with Holy Spirit, you are never helpless. So when you hit a point of resistance and your feelings pull you to choose work over loved ones in your personal life, what keeps you from recognizing those truths? What makes it hard to surrender your will and acting in accordance with God's truth? That you're loved, that you're valued, that you're worthy, that you're strong and capable. When you can see these and you can grab on to God's truth and to act in accordance with that, then you're going to be able to start reclaiming that balance. You're going to make the decision not for work, but for your loved ones, for your personal life, for your faith, so that you can begin to live more of that life that God has in mind for you and not caught up in the deception of that. That gives you your foundation to break free from these fears and act with confidence. So by anchoring into your Christian identity, what small action do you think you can take to trust that things will be okay? Because when you feel that point of resistance, when you feel that emotion pop up, or you see the pattern of the protective behaviors, what's that tiny, small little thing that you can do to trust that things will be okay? That God's got it. And that so that you can get to the point where you can feel and believe that there's no reason to act from fear in this situation at work. So something for you to meditate on is 2 Timothy 1:7. God has not given me a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. So, for you to identify and put into practice in your stress management plan, this may be a good verse for you to meditate on and to find what those truths are. What are those small actions that you can take to trust that things will be okay and to shift you from fear into acting with confidence? So now let's get into the exercise. This is all about recognizing that emotion and then choosing what to do once you've seen that emotion popping up. So it's a variation on capture, challenge, change exercise that we did about negative thoughts. This one is identify, anchor, act, and let go. And it's all about using your emotions as flags and that they're trying to tell you to pay attention. And as you go through this exercise, if you're one of those people that has difficulty recognizing or naming emotions, do go back to the emotions wheel that we talked about a few episodes ago and feel free to use that tool because it can really help you. Because these emotions can pop up in a whole bunch of different ways, and they're not going to come necessarily through is like intense fear, anger. They're going to come into one of the ones that's a little softer, because that's what's the safe way for it to express for inside within your life and to come to your attention. So for this exercise, let's take a look at one of your core worst case scenario fears and see how that's impacting the number of hours that you're working. Look at a stressful scenario that you faced this week that led you to working late in the evening, missing a family event, or skipping some personal time. Okay, got one in mind? So the purpose of this exercise is really to help you through tough challenges on your boundaries. So when you're at that point and you're like, I know what I want to do, but this is really difficult decision because something's challenging you to maintain your boundaries, that's when this exercise is for. It's specifically for this situation. It's to get you to recognize that point of resistance and then have a way to work through it to choose that healthier response that supports work life balance. So instead of taking an automatic action, a conditioned response, a protective behavior that keeps you into that cycle of overwork, imbalance, stress, and exhaustion. You can find your freedom by using your emotions as an indicator to identify when attention is change is needed. Because when you change your thoughts, you can change your actions. Your emotions are just flags to help detect it. So the first step in this process is identify. So identify the fear. What emotion is driving you to stay late or overcommit? So you want to write this down is I feel the name of the emotion and the reason for this emotion. So as an example, I feel worried and think that if I don't answer emails tonight, my boss will assume I'm not committed. So, see, it's naming the emotion and the reason for it. So, then this next step, you want to anchor it in identity. So, what truth from God or your core values can help to anchor you? So, here's a couple of different examples. I don't know which one will resonate best with you, but it can get you a couple of different ways to think about this. So, are you a child of God where your worth is not determined by your boss's perceptions, but because God and Jesus just love you and see you as that precious child? Do you know your value in Christ in that you're still a committed professional? No matter what anybody else thinks, you know that you're committed. And is that okay for you? Is that the truth? Here's another one. God calls me to care for my beloved spouse and children. I have responsibilities and a commitment to them that no one else can fulfill. So now you want to put this into a truth statement so that you can have it for that point of comparison to that identify statement. So the way that this statement goes out is the truth is I am whatever your identity is, and I choose to be identity. So you can phrase it in either way. So in this example, I had to make the phrasing work. I had to play with it a little bit. I am committed, meaning I choose to be committed to my family and my work, and God calls me to rest with my loved ones. So you see how you're putting this anchor statement together? Then we go into plan. So what small boundary can I set today to honor my work-life balance? So what do you choose to do? How do you choose to act? So in this example, I will log off at 6 p.m. and respond to my boss in the morning. So how do these three different individual statements feel? And you'll want to play with what you come up with to get a real statement of truth where the alternative action is clear. So when you're putting this all together, this is how this can come together. I feel worried and think that if I don't answer emails tonight, my boss will assume I'm not committed. The truth is, I am committed to my family and my work. I choose to listen as God calls me to rest with my loved ones. I choose to log off at 6 p.m. and respond to my boss in the morning. So you see how that acknowledges the fear and what it is that that protective behavior is. You have a truth, and then you're choosing what that alternative action is. You're not going automatically into that initial protective behavior. What did you come up with for your statement? So now the last step of this is because typically these resistance points, they're not just a one and done. They keep repeating. So if you find yourself where you're challenged and you're like, I need to answer this email and I'm going to end up staying late to finish this email or to work on this tonight, it's going to pop back up again. So you want to pray on this statement and make sure that you can let go of that fear. In concept, what this is that it's integrating the prayer as a bridge between recognizing your fear and taking action. Surrendering your fears to God can help to release the grip. So you take your statement and you then use this as part of your regular prayers. Lord, I surrender my fear and worry of being seen as uncommitted to my work to you. Remind me that my worth is in you, not my work or my boss's thoughts. Help me trust that you, God, are in control even when I set boundaries. Amen. So you see how that helps you reinforce this. So you see it the first time it comes up, the prayer reinforces and gets you to start resolving and turning over these fears over to God so you're not burdened by them. So that they are less likely to stress you and to get triggered. So once you've put this together, you should be able to consistently take the action that aligns with your boundary. Maybe this gets all summed up for you in a little post-it note that you put up on the computer, and it's to remind you is I will turn off my computer at 6 p.m. trusting that God holds tomorrow in his hands. If that's that reminder to help you to let go of this at the end. So that was a quick example and run through on this exercise of identify, anchor, act, and let go. You see how it helps you to see the flag, get the truth of it, get away from those that deception that was coming with the emotion. So you see the truth, and instead of acting automatically, you're acting in the way that makes the most sense to you and who you are as a child of God. So if there's any questions at all on this exercise, do reach out, send me an email in regards to it, and I can be reached at Sharon@whisperingfieldswellness.com. I really hope that this exercise has given you plenty of ideas on and creating the changes that you want in your life so that you can have less stress and have more work-life balance. This today's episode was all about merging a number of different things together by recognizing the fears that you have that are deep-seated and how they can end up driving protective behaviors that make it hard for you to change the number of hours that you're working or your work habits because of how tightly your career or your financial well-being gets tied into your identity. So by recognizing these protective behaviors, you can start changing them by recognizing and releasing and letting go of that core fear and other emotions that pop up with it. You're able to feel less stress. That's how all of this comes together. So I really hope that this has given you a little bit of wisdom and perspective to help you and to put into action in your daily life. I know this was a very high level run through. Click the link to download my journal worksheets to help you cultivate greater self awareness. There's more than just the tools shared today included in this download. Or if you want to work with me so you can put these stress recovery tools together better and go deeper, click the services link below. As a stress recovery coach, I'm here to help you explore more of what underlies your stress and imbalance and ensure that you have the motivation and accountability to make the changes you desire in your life. I can come alongside to support and encourage you and share a few strategies and tools to help you with mindset, lifestyle, and diet changes. I know you can reduce stress and improve your work life harmony. I'll see you next episode. Have a blessed day.